Many of you will have seen this before. So let's now turn to the gold and silver prints, which we think were all produced by Mizuno and or his family. Now there are one or two caveats about this, and there are still unanswered questions, as ever. This one obviously is staged in the studio. The figures and the rickshaw in the front are real. The background is painted, so it's very much like a Victorian studio. So you've got a painted backdrop. Burton was the author of two successful manuals of photography, and an innovator photographically, particularly in terms of developing Japan's photographic infrastructure. And to quote from one of his reports, I have reserved for the last notice of what is an exhibit, perhaps the most interesting of any, because it is quite new. The exhibitor is H. Mizuno of Yokohama, and what is shown is a series of photographs in gold on dark-coloured lacquer. The intention is to produce photographically the equivalent of hand-done pictorial work in gold in lacquer, one of the fine arts in which Japan far excels any other country in the world. The effect considered decoratively is very pleasing. The process has as yet been kept secret, and that was published in October 1890. Subsequently, in a second report, he wrote, I passed the house of the inventor the other day and examined all the samples to be seen at the time, and I must say that some of them, large panels for example, with designs in gold on black lacquer, appeared to me to be of very high merit from a decorative point of view. I do not know whether any samples of this kind of work have yet reached America, but I should think it would be popular. He was, however, unimpressed with a picture of Queen Victoria, probably this one. This sort of also makes the point that Mizuno, as well as using Japanese subjects, was quite capable and frequently did take negatives from anybody and reprint them in his new technique. So here's Mizuno, born in Shizuoka, another town not terribly far away from Tokyo, in 1852, the fourth generation of a soy sauce brewing family. As a young man, he was apprenticed to a tea dealer in Yokohama. He learned photography from Shirai, who was a pupil of Shimaoka. We've seen a picture already by Shimaoka. In Meiji 3, these Japanese dates, they start from the date of the beginning of the reign of that emperor. Meiji 3 is 1870. Mizuno returned to Shizuoka and opened a photographic studio. He wanted to improve his photography and went back to do more study, and finished up working for a while for Farsari. We also saw pictures by Farsari just now. And Farsari's workshop or studio burnt down in a fire, and Farsari and Mizuno then went on an expedition round the pretty parts of Japan, taking photographs to replace the negatives that were lost in the fire. He left Farsari in 1887, which is Meiji 20, to start work on his new concept, which he had dreamed up, of so-called permanent photographs, in business on his own, initially using a process to make photographs on porcelain, but very quickly moving on to the things that we're seeing here, which are gold photographs on wood. Now, this is the sort of thing which gold on lacquer was known for. This is obviously done by hand. This has been done in China and Japan for hundreds of years, perhaps 1,000 years. And essentially one of the things that Mizuno was trying to do was to replicate the materials and in a way modernize the technique without losing it. So he wanted to produce something which could be seen as the 1,000-year-old tradition of gold on lacquer, produced using much the same materials, but just with a photographic step in order to actually create the image. This was what was in his mind. The properties of this lacquer are quite important to all of this. The lacquer tree produces sap, which is actually quite toxic to humans, and so has to be handled rather carefully when it's fresh. But once it's hardened, and it's always mixed with various compounds, iron oxides, other pigments, once it's hardened it produces a hard, smooth, polishable, shiny lacquer, the colour of which is given by whatever pigments have been put in, because by itself it's a clear material. And this lacquer is normally put on in multiple thin layers, as many as 40 layers sometimes, polishing between the layers to produce a fairly thick, hard surface. It's almost like making onto a piece of wood, which is the substrate, making onto a piece of wood. It's like making a coat of hard plastic on top almost. All of this has been traditionally established as a manual technique, and it struck him as the basis on which to put his photographs. And the way that you put, when you're working manually, the way that you get the gold onto the surface is having made your multiple layers of lacquer and got a smooth surface. You then put sticky lacquer on the surface and sprinkle gold powder, which is then, all that can harden and then gets polished again, and this gold decoration on the surface is done by effectively painting with glue, if you like, and sprinkling the gold onto the glue and having it stick. So on the back of one of these pictures we find this label. I shall just read it to you. It says, "Patent Yokohama Mizuno, the pure gold and silver lacquer photographs. The one I invented after long weary years is entirely a fancy new article, quite different from ordinary photographs, and guarantee never fades in its colour. I therefore beg to state that my constant endeavour will be, by the excellence of the wares, the moderation of the charges, and unremitting attention to the wishes of customers, to ensure and retain that patronage and support which I now respectfully solicit. H. Mizuno, Fudushita, Ota, Yokohama." Now, there had been, before this, a dust-on process invented in France. It was invented by Henri Garnier and Alphonse Salmon in 1858, and it's essentially a variant of the gum bichromate process, but involving the use, instead of pigments, involving sugar or honey, so that when the contact print is made on the coating of this emulsion, it's not really an emulsion, the stickiness which inheres in the original material is decreased by exposure to light. So the more sunshine hits a particular part of the surface, the harder it gets and the less sticky it is. So you've got a surface which is covered in a material of variable stickiness or tackiness. And so obviously then if you sprinkle that with powder and gently brush it, you get a visible photograph. That was not a successful process in Europe. It never went anywhere. It was several decades earlier, and I think the chances are that Mizuno ever heard of it are fairly remote. He could have, but probably he was reinventing from scratch. So where are all these places? Just so that we know, There's Mount Fuji, which appears in lots of the pictures. There's Tokyo, all the people. There's Yokohama, quite close to Tokyo. Ota is the address that he gave on that label we just saw, and Shizuoka is where he was born. So this little patch of Japan was very much his stamping ground. Here's a cross-section of the lacquer layers from the kiji, which is the wood base. That's timber. The number of these layers is actually quite variable, and they've all got names, and we don't need to worry about any of that. Suffice it to say that there's a bunch of layers polished in between, hardened in between, so it takes several months to produce a blank panel ready for work. Of course you produce lots and do it, you do them all at once, but even so it takes you quite a long time to build up your base material. Mizuno took out a patent in Japan, and again, reading a few pieces, the invention is related to a method of making maki-e. Maki-e is the Japanese word meaning effectively sprinkled pictures. The e bit means picture, and the maki bit means sprinkled. So maki-e, which is the traditional art, but also now a new photographic art, by transfer of a photographic image onto the surface of urushi lacquerware. Now, I'm going to try and sort of build up how it works in a couple of slides so that you can see how it goes. The white parts in here are actually, on these pictures, are actually transparent, so just bear that in mind. So the first part of the patent says that any image can be reproduced on a negative plate using ordinary photography. So you take a normal photographic negative. Contact print to the sun for about 5 to 10 minutes using his material, which has been coated on to a glass plate. During exposure, the transparent portion of the negative plate transmits light into the yakuban. The yakuban is the name of the coated plate which has been sensitized with this bichromate material, and hardens it, so the sunlight hardens it. The opaque portion does not pass the light, so there the surface remains tacky. So that is then contact printed onto a, so this is now reversed because it's been contact printed, and I made that black because it was silver in the negative, and this represents, quite unrealistically, the stickiness, the pattern of stickiness which has been built up on the plate. So then dusting with gold powder produces a picture in gold on transparent, which we see there. So the yakuban with variable tackiness is printed with this metallic dust of gold, typically, could be also silver, which is then wiped off using a soft brush, and this fixes the metal powder to the surface, where it remains more or less depending on the degree of tackiness at that point on the surface. And he emphasizes that very little metallic powder remains on the surface, and therefore it's a very economical process. Although it uses gold, it uses very little. To keep it in position, a single layer of collodion is applied to the image, which is rinsed then and produces a photograph in gold on transparent. After the rinse and while still damp, you put a thin sheet of paper over the surface and rub it on by hand, and that transfers your image from the glass plate onto the paper. And you peel it off, and then you transfer again using a new layer of urushi this time, to stick down the gold, the pattern of gold, onto the final surface. And because of course it's transparent, we now have a right way round picture on black with the highlights in gold, shading down to the shadows in black. So there's a little summary of the steps. So that's the original negative, all those steps, and there's our print. Finally, this is polished using powdered antler horn, deer antler. You have to use the right materials. With powdered deer antler, you polish the surface and you put a final single coating of lacquer on the surface to protect it from abrasion. So that's how it's done. If you read all of the textbooks which happen to mention this process that were written before our article, they're all wrong. I cannot say it more clearly than that. They completely, earlier authors didn't read the patent, didn't study microscopically the surface of what they were looking at, and they just guessed, and they guessed wrong. There was a 1935 book, Art Photography, published in Japan, which describes a very similar process but without a transfer stage. And some more practical details can be gathered from a meeting between a researcher at Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Photography, who in 1998 met with members of Mizuno's family, because they had continued to use the process, apparently not for making pictures for tourists, but for example for making permanent pictures to go on gravestones, which was a custom, cultural custom there, and they wanted a method to transfer a photographic image onto a hard surface of stone in this case, and they continue to use this process. There are, and this picture, which is a little bit hard to understand, but this is pictures of a transfer paper with the image on it, looked at by reflected light and by transmitted light, and in this case these were obviously quite small images intended for some small articles, smaller I think than any of the pictures that we've got out here today. By 1998 there was nobody alive who'd actually operated the process, however, so they were all speaking second hand of, what my dad did, what my granddad did, that sort of thing, and so how precise and reliable the information is not completely sure. We have done, as part of our project, we did quite a bit of chemical analysis which produced useful information, but not surprising probably information. The gold is really gold. The materials in the lacquer are typical sort of dark pigments that you might expect to find in the lacquer. So it is all very much as you would expect. So we can now look a bit at the pictures that we actually find in modern times. And in modern times we've identified 4 types. Type A, illustrated here, is a gold photograph on black lacquer on wood, with the back of the wood also lacquered. There may be stiffening ribs. There are stiffening ribs here. There may be over the rear surface glued on canvas, or at least heavy textile, or there may be just lacquer which may be plain as it is here, or it may have simple patterns combed into it by scraping over with a comb or a coarse brush. Lacquer stamps in this type A, lacquer stamps in the lacquer identify Mizuno as the author both in Japanese and in English, so we know these were made by him. Now type B is similar. It's a gold photograph on black lacquer on a wooden panel. The back of the panel thickly lacquered with lots of sort of brushed or combed patterns, different patterns on different ones, but they all look something like that. no ribs, and usually no maker's identification. Type C is a gold photograph on black lacquer as part of some other item. A gold photograph of part of a box top, an album cover, as we've got over there, a tray, a little casket, whatever. Lots on them, but they look just the same. And then type D, which this is the back view, which is a gold photograph on glass, and the photograph is on the, as you view it, is on the back of the glass. So you look through the glass and you see the photograph, and on the back of that is, once again, black lacquer. There it is, this time not combed but just painted on, usually quite roughly, and again no maker's identification. Now we treated in 2007, when we wrote the article, we treated type D all together with the rest, but thinking has moved on, so I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, because we don't think it's quite as simple as we thought before. And the key question really is whether all of these types can be attributed to Mizuno's workshop. The only ones that carry his actual marks are lacquer prints on wood of type A. We know that he had patent protection. We know that the process was a transfer process, allowing him to use any substrate he wanted, or at least a wide range of substrates for the final result. We have seen only one Japanese gold print with anybody else's name stuck to it. It was type B, and it has the marks of Ogawa. Now, Ogawa was a neighbour of Mizuno in Yokohama, and according to his advertisements, he began to offer Mizuno prints in 1900, and presumably under license. We'll sort of come back to that in a minute. In terms of the subjects, in all cases the subjects are either typical Meiji period tourist attractions, landscapes, temples, traditional characters, whatever, or portraits in the case of type A, or occasionally type B portraits. Very occasionally types A to C are found in silver instead of gold. There's just one silver example here. That's the one on the album. Never seen a silver type D. That's the glass ones. Many of the pictures, perhaps even most of the pictures, were not taken by Mizuno himself. He printed for many of the well-known photographers working in Yokohama at the time. Typically, if they were putting together an album for a tourist, tourists are almost by definition rich. You're not going to come from Europe to Japan without having a reasonably large amount of money, either that or a job in the shipping industry. So most of them were rich. They wanted a souvenir to take home. They would go to a photographer who would put together an album of the pictures they wanted, and they would choose from his whole library of pictures the ones they would like to have that would remind them of their trip. Often those pictures would have been from more than one photographer, not just the one whose studio you happened to be in. And from time to time, if you decided you'd have a Mizuno print on the cover of your album, it would be a reproduction of one of the images inside the album. So once again, here is Mizuno printing negatives from the guy down the road this way, the guy up the road that way, whatever it might be. So a few examples. Genre scene, musical ladies. I suppose you might say geisha, but that covers a multitude of sins. Actresses. Almost certainly all of this stuff is posed rather. This is not an actual musical performance. It's It's a group of young women posed, dressed in the right clothes, holding the right instruments. A couple of girls with a screen. A small box with a picture of Fuji, in this case from Kashiwabara, on the lid of the box. A little bit unusual in that the painting on the lid goes over the photograph in a couple of places. So obviously the photograph was printed on the lid first, and then it went down the road to a painter who did a bit of cherry blossom decoration on the front to posh it up. Tea picking near Mishima. That one's here. So many of these actually. Kinkakuji Temple, type B, this one. That's a popular subject. It was also a very popular subject for paper prints. Now you remember the Farsari album? We saw this picture but flipped. It was the other way around. And in fact I've got two examples of this negative here, one in the flipped form and one in the correct form. Why it was flipped, why this one is flipped, I don't know. It's a Mizuno, this one is Mizuno's own photograph, we know that. Fishing boats and a castle. See, that's a rather un-Japanese looking castle actually. So, you know, they vary quite a bit. It's definitely a Japanese scene. Type B, a suspension bridge on the Fuji River, again, also type B. It's probably quite a wobbly bridge. And portraits. An American woman, I think American because that's where I got the picture from. There was a lot. He did, we shall also come to this I guess, he did mail order. You could order, if you had a picture of yourself that you liked or of your family member, whatever, you could send it to Japan. It would take a few weeks to get there. He would do the work, it would take a few weeks to come back. So after 3 or 4 months you could have a gold print of a family picture. Yeah, we don't know who that one is. Unknown man, type B. That's the trouble with a lot of these. There's not usually a label. A little bit less usual. A cover of a family with 3 separate pictures stuck to it. Westerners. So obviously again done for visitors. And again, fairly unusual, a multi-portrait image, some quite charming and American-looking characters there. Some of these are things that I've just seen on the web, or people have seen my website where there's a summary of this, and they've written to me and showed me their pictures. So thank you in absentia to them. We can move on briefly to silver, which is much less common. A few percent only of the ones that survive today, at any rate, are in silver rather than gold. This is in quite good condition for a silver one because silver tends to tarnish even though it's got a lacquer coating on it. Fuji from Taganura, it's type A. That's the album on the front of the album on the table. It's silver, it's quite damaged. We'll talk about damage again in a minute because most of them are damaged. So it's got a silver Mizuno image of what's it? Shiralto Falls. We think from a negative by Farsari. Inside the album there are 18 very nice hand-coloured ordinary album imprints by various photographers. The cover is the same sort of structure, wooden boards, as the structure of the frames which you typically find around type A and type B prints on wood. So who made them? The problem is still that most of the prints aren't signed. Were they all made by Mizuno?